It is the true account of a man who arrived in this world with nothing at all. No father waiting to greet him, no fortune prepared for him, no title above his name, no army behind him, and who left this world as the single most remembered human being in the history of mankind. Billions of people, across more than 14 centuries and every continent on earth, still whisper his name in their prayers 5 times a day, still try to imitate the way he spoke to strangers, still find comfort in the way he treated the poor, the orphaned, the frightened, and the forgotten. He did not conquer through weapons. He conquered through patience. He did not silence his enemies with power. He won them over, slowly, painfully, through the sheer weight of his character. Every insult thrown at his face was met with forgiveness. Every stone thrown at his feet was met with a quiet prayer for the very person who threw it. This is the story of Muhammad, peace be upon him. A story of loss piled upon loss, of love that never wavered, of cruelty faced with astonishing calm, and of a small flame that the darkest years of Arabian history could never manage to put out, no matter how hard they tried. Sit somewhere comfortable. Let your thoughts slow down for a while. Put aside whatever you already believe or don't believe, and simply listen the way you would listen to the story of any human being who lived, suffered, loved, and endured. Because before anything else, this is a story about being human under the heaviest weight imaginable, and somehow choosing kindness anyway. To understand why this story carries the weight that it does, you first need to picture the world it was born into. More than 1400 years ago, the Arabian Peninsula was an unforgiving stretch of desert, heat, and tribal pride, sitting at the crossroads of old trade routes, but largely ignored by the great empires of the time. There was no central government to appeal to, no shared system of law, no institution that protected the powerless from the powerful. Wells and oases were fought over. Bloodlines mattered more than character. And spiritually, the people had drifted so far from any coherent belief that they carved figures out of stone, wood, and even dates, gave them names, decorated them with jewelry, and knelt before them as though a lump of rock could hear a whispered prayer. Some tribes, in moments of desperation and hunger, would grind up the very date idols they worshipped and eat them, unaware or unbothered by the irony of consuming their own god. Human life held very different value depending on your birth. A newborn son was celebrated with feasts and pride. A newborn daughter, in far too many households, was treated as a burden, a source of shame, or worse. Some fathers, driven by a twisted sense of honor, buried their infant daughters alive in the sand rather than raise them, believing this act somehow protected the family name. Slavery was widespread and brutal, with enslaved people treated as property rather than human beings, beaten for the smallest offenses, and given no legal protection whatsoever. Wealth translated directly into impunity. The richer a man was, the less consequence he faced for cruelty. Tribal wars could erupt over something as small as an insult exchanged at a well, or a stolen animal, and then drag on for decades, fed generation after generation, by revenge rather than reason. Drinking, gambling, and casual violence were woven into daily life so thoroughly that few people even questioned them. This was the world, cracked and bleeding under its own contradictions, into which a single child was about to be born, a child the entire region was, without knowing it, desperately in need of. In the city of Mecca, in the year 570 of the Common Era, during the blessed month of Rabi al-Awwal, on a Monday morning, a baby boy came into the world. His father, a young man named Abdullah from a respected but not especially wealthy family, had died on a trading journey months earlier, meaning his son would never hear his voice, never see his face, never know what it felt like to be carried on his father's shoulders. His mother, a woman named Amina, held her newborn son alone, grieving a husband she had just lost, while simultaneously cradling the child he had never lived to meet. In that mixture of sorrow and tenderness, she named her son Muhammad, an unusual choice of name at the time, meaning roughly, the one who is praised. When curious relatives asked why she had chosen a name so rarely used among their people, she is remembered to have answered simply that she hoped her son would be praised, not merely by the people around her, but by the heavens themselves. Neither she, nor anyone standing near her that day, could have possibly understood how prophetic that quiet hope would eventually become. Following a custom common among noble families of Makkah at the time, infants were often sent away from the crowded and unhealthy air of the city to be raised for their earliest years by a wet nurse in the open desert, where the environment was believed to build stronger bodies and clearer speech. A woman from a modest Bedouin tribe named Halima took the infant Muhammad into her care, and those close to her later described how everything around her seemed to shift for the better from the moment he arrived in her home. Her livestock, once thin and struggling, grew healthier and produced more milk than they ever had before. Her household, previously marked by hardship, seemed wrapped in an unusual sense of peace. Years later, she would say openly that she had never experienced blessings quite like the ones that arrived alongside that particular child. Eventually, as custom required, the boy was returned to his mother in Makkah, but his childhood offered him little in the way of rest or stability. When he was around 6 years old, Amina took him on a journey to visit relatives and to see the grave of the husband she had lost before their son's birth. On the return journey, in a small village called Abwa, she fell suddenly and seriously ill, and within a short time, she died. The boy, who had never once known his father, now stood beside his mother's fresh grave as well. 6 years old, and entirely orphaned, in the middle of the desert, far from the comforts of home. He did not have the luxury of a normal childhood grief, wrapped in the arms of relatives who understood his pain intimately. There was no one left who could hold him quite the way a mother holds her child. And yet, those around him at the time observed something unusual. He carried this enormous sorrow with a quiet, composed dignity that seemed to belong to someone far older than 6. His grandfather, a respected elder of Makkah named Abdul Muttalib, took him in afterward and loved him with visible tenderness, often keeping the boy close by his side, even during important tribal gatherings. But this arrangement, too, proved painfully short-lived. Only 2 years later, his grandfather also passed away, leaving the boy orphaned for a third time before he had even reached the age of 8. He was then taken in by his uncle, Abu Talib, a man of modest means, with a large family of his own to support, yet a man who loved his orphan nephew as though he were his own son, protecting him fiercely and consistently for decades to come. Even as a young boy, growing up in someone else's household, dependent on the generosity of relatives, Muhammad stood apart from those around him in ways people could not fail to notice. He never lied, not even about small, inconsequential things where a lie might have been convenient. He never raised his voice in anger, no matter how frustrating a situation became. He worked diligently at whatever tasks were given to him, helped with household chores without complaint, and treated everyone he encountered, whether wealthy merchant or enslaved servant, with the same quiet, consistent respect. For a time he tended sheep, a humble and largely thankless job that nonetheless demanded enormous patience, gentleness, and the ability to remain calm even when the animals wandered or the weather turned harsh. Slowly, without ever campaigning for it or seeking recognition, he earned a reputation that spread across Makkah. People began referring to him as Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. It was not a title bestowed by any king, council, or formal institution. It was a title the ordinary people of Makkah gave him themselves, organically, because in a society thick with dishonesty and broken promises, they had simply never encountered anyone whose word could be trusted so completely, so consistently, without exception. By the time he reached his 20s, Muhammad possessed no fortune, no land, and no powerful family connections capable of opening doors that remained shut to ordinary men. What he possessed instead was a spotless reputation that had by then traveled well beyond his own neighborhood. Makkah functioned as a major trading hub along ancient caravan routes, and many young men made their living transporting goods between distant cities. Word of Muhammad's unusual honesty eventually reached a wealthy widow named Khadija bint Khuwaylid, a successful and independent businesswoman who managed her own trading caravans and employed men to run them on her behalf. Khadija had grown weary of hiring representatives who cut corners, exaggerated their expenses, pocketed extra profit, or mishandled the goods entrusted to them. When someone in her circle mentioned the young man the whole city had taken to calling Al-Amin, she decided to test his character for herself. She offered him a position leading one of her trade caravans on a journey to Syria, sending along her trusted servant, Maysara, to accompany him and observe. The journey proved remarkably successful, more successful, in fact, than any of her previous ventures under other men's leadership. But what struck Khadija most deeply wasn't merely the size of the Prophet Muhammad brought back to her. It was his complete transparency about every single detail of the transaction, and the fact that he requested nothing beyond what had been fairly agreed upon in advance. Maysara, who had traveled alongside him for the entire journey and observed him closely in both business dealings and private moments, returned with stories of a man unlike any he had ever worked under, calm under pressure, respectful even toward strangers and those beneath him in social standing, careful and deliberate in his speech, and remarkably gentle in temperament. Khadija, who was roughly 40 years old at the time and had already declined marriage proposals from numerous wealthy and influential suitors, found herself drawn not toward Muhammad's wealth, since he had essentially none, but toward the sheer quality of his character, something she had rarely encountered in her years of business dealings with powerful men. Through a trusted intermediary, she sent a quiet proposal of marriage his way. When the message reached him, Muhammad, who was around 25 at the time, did not respond immediately or impulsively. Instead, he sought the counsel of his uncle Abu Talib, the man who had raised him, and Abu Talib, recognizing Khadija's wisdom, integrity, and standing in the community, encouraged the match wholeheartedly. They were married in a modest ceremony, free of excess or public spectacle, and what followed was a partnership that would endure for 25 years, lasting until Khadija's eventual death. She would go on to become the very first person in the world to believe in his prophethood without hesitation, the one who comforted him during the most terrifying night of his life, and the memory he continued to honor with tenderness for the rest of his own life, long after she was gone. Though it was entirely common for wealthy men of that era and social standing to take multiple wives, Muhammad remained devoted solely to Khadija throughout the entire time she was alive, never once marrying another woman while she lived. Even many years later, after her passing, when he had followers, respect, and influence beyond anything Makkah had ever witnessed, he continued to speak of her fondly, still remembering vividly that she was the one who believed in him before the rest of the world ever did, back when belief cost her something real. As Muhammad entered his late 30s, something inside him grew steadily more restless and unsettled. Makkah's society had not changed in any meaningful way during the years of his marriage. Idols still crowded the courtyard surrounding the Kaaba. The wealthy still exploited the poor without consequence. Baby girls were still, in some households, being buried in the sand. Enslaved people still suffered without any legal recourse whatsoever. He could not simply accept this as an unchangeable fact of life, the way so many around him seemed to. A deep, persistent discomfort settled into him, a quiet longing for something the world surrounding him seemed entirely incapable of offering, genuine, unshakable truth. He began retreating, more and more frequently, to a small and isolated cave carved into a mountain just outside the city, known as Hira. There, far removed from the noise, gossip, and visible corruption of Makkah's streets, he would sit for long stretches of time, occasionally for several days at a stretch, lost in quiet reflection, searching earnestly for meaning beneath the idols and empty traditions that everyone around him seemed to accept without ever questioning them. He was 40 years old when everything in his life changed permanently. During one of his extended retreats inside the cave, while completely alone, he suddenly became aware of an overwhelming presence, unlike anything he had ever encountered before. A voice, powerful and unmistakably commanding, instructed him plainly, "Read." Startled and genuinely afraid, he replied honestly that he did not know how to read. He had never received any formal education. The command repeated itself, more forcefully this time, "Read." Once again, he gave the identical answer, his fear intensifying. On the third and final repetition, the voice continued further, instructing him to read in the name of his Lord, the one who had created all things that exist. The presence, he would later come to understand, was the angel Jibril, sent specifically to deliver the opening words of what would eventually become the Quran. Muhammad, shaken to his core and genuinely terrified by the intensity of the experience, hurried down the mountain toward home as quickly as his legs would carry him, his heart pounding uncontrollably. He asked Khadija to wrap him tightly in a blanket in an attempt to calm his racing pulse and steady his breathing. Once he had regained enough composure to speak clearly, he told her everything that had happened inside the cave. She did not doubt him, not even for a single moment. Instead, she reassured him gently but firmly, reminding him that a man as honest as he was, as generous toward the poor, as supportive of guests and strangers, and as consistently reliable in every hardship faced by those around him, would never be abandoned by God under any circumstance. It was, in her words, simply not something that could happen to a man of his character. That single day marked the true beginning of a mission unlike anything the region, or arguably the world, had ever witnessed before. Not a call to build a new empire, not an attempt to seize political power, but a persistent call to restore basic justice, to defend those with no one else to defend them, and to remind an entire civilization of a truth it had somehow, over generations, managed to completely forget. For a period of time following that first extraordinary encounter inside the cave, no further revelation arrived, leaving Muhammad in a state of uncertainty and quiet anxiety, unsure exactly what would be expected of him going forward. Eventually, a second message reached him, considerably clearer in its instruction than the first. Rise now, and warn the people around you. Purify your intentions thoroughly. Remain patient, no matter what price that patience might eventually demand of you. He understood immediately that silence was no longer an option available to him, but he also understood, with equal clarity, that the message he now carried was genuinely dangerous. Dangerous enough that revealing it too quickly or too loudly could potentially destroy everything before it ever had a real chance to take root and grow. So he began cautiously, speaking first only to those closest to him, people whose trust he had already earned over years of consistent honesty. Khadija, his devoted wife, believed in him immediately and without reservation, becoming the very first human being on earth to formally accept the message. Soon afterward, his young cousin Ali, still just a child living under the same roof, happened to observe him praying quietly in private, asked what exactly he was doing, and upon hearing a simple explanation, accepted the message without a moment's hesitation, despite his young age. Zayd, a formerly enslaved man who had endured captivity and been separated from his own family as a child before eventually becoming like an adopted son to Muhammad, also believed wholeheartedly. And then came his close and long-trusted friend Abu Bakr, a widely respected figure throughout Makkah, who accepted the message the very moment he heard it explained, reasoning simply that a man who had never told a single lie in his entire life had absolutely no logical reason to begin lying now, especially about something of such enormous consequence. Abu Bakr did not keep this newfound belief entirely to himself. Quietly and carefully, mindful of the danger involved, he began sharing the message with people whose discretion and character he personally trusted, and gradually, one person at a time, a small circle of early believers began to take shape, men and women who would eventually go on to become some of the most significant and celebrated figures in the entire history of Islam. For roughly 3 years, this message spread almost entirely in private, taught quietly inside homes and in secluded corners of the city, deliberately kept away from public attention, because Makkah's rigid society, built firmly upon tribal pride, ancestral idol worship, and strict social hierarchy, was simply not yet prepared to hear a message that boldly declared all human beings fundamentally equal, regardless of their wealth, their tribal lineage, or the color of their skin. Eventually, inevitably, the period of careful secrecy came to its natural end. Muhammad received instruction to first warn his own immediate family, and then to take his message fully into the public sphere. He climbed the hill of Safa, a location traditionally used throughout Makkah for making significant public announcements, and called out loudly to the gathered crowd below, posing them a simple but pointed question. If he warned them plainly that an enemy army was hiding just behind the nearby mountain, fully prepared to launch a surprise attack, would they believe his warning without demanding proof? Without any hesitation whatsoever, the crowd answered that of course they would believe him. They had never once, in all their years of knowing him, caught him in a lie of any kind. He then delivered his actual message with total clarity. Abandon the worship of lifeless idols carved from stone and wood. Worship instead only the one true God who created everything, and turned decisively away from the destructive path their entire society had been following for generations. He asked for absolutely nothing in return for this warning. No wealth, no political loyalty, no personal favors of any kind. Only that they honestly consider the truth being offered to them. The reaction that followed was nowhere close to what a lifetime of earned trust might reasonably have predicted. Rather than pausing to genuinely consider his words, a significant portion of the crowd began openly mocking him instead. His own uncle, a man named Abu Lahab, responded with visible contempt, publicly cursing his own nephew and storming away from the gathering in barely contained rage. From that precise moment forward, the entire atmosphere surrounding Muhammad shifted dramatically and permanently. The very same people who had once respected him deeply enough to nickname him Al-Amin now began openly calling him mad, a dangerous sorcerer, or merely a clever poet spinning elaborate tales. Anything at all that allowed them to avoid confronting the uncomfortable possibility that he might genuinely be telling the truth. When simple mockery failed to silence him or slow the growing number of converts, the powerful leaders of Quraysh attempted a different strategy entirely: outright bribery. They sent one of their most widely respected and eloquent men, a figure named Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, to formally offer Muhammad substantial wealth, marriage into one of Makkah's most powerful families, or even outright leadership over the entire city, provided he agreed to permanently stop preaching his message. Muhammad listened to the entire offer patiently, without interruption, and when Utbah finally finished speaking, he responded not with a counter-argument or negotiation, but simply by reciting several verses from the Quran aloud. Utbah, visibly and deeply shaken by what he had just heard, returned to his fellow tribal leaders and admitted candidly that whatever this phenomenon actually was, it bore no resemblance whatsoever to ordinary poetry or common sorcery. The bribes failed entirely. The public mockery not only continued, but intensified sharply in the months that followed. People took to throwing handfuls of dirt directly at him as he walked calmly through the crowded streets of Makkah. On more than one occasion, the discarded intestines of slaughtered animals were deliberately placed across his back while he knelt in prayer. Neighbors living near his home took to hurling garbage directly toward his front door on a regular basis. And through all of it, remarkably, he never once responded with violence of any kind, never raised his voice in anger or retaliation, never cursed the people who tormented him day after day. He simply cleaned himself off each time, quietly resumed his prayers, and continued teaching his message to anyone willing to genuinely listen. Because Muhammad remained protected, at least for a time, by the standing and reputation of his own tribe, his most determined opponents within Quraysh found themselves unable to attack him directly without risking a much broader and more dangerous tribal conflict. So instead, with calculated cruelty, they redirected their hostility toward his growing number of followers, particularly targeting those individuals who had no tribal protection whatsoever to shield them: the poor, the socially marginalized, and especially the enslaved. Bilal ibn Rabah, an enslaved man who had quietly accepted the new faith despite the enormous personal risk involved, quickly became a target of especially brutal punishment. His enslaver repeatedly dragged him out into the open desert, forced him to lie flat on scorching sand beneath the unrelenting midday sun, and placed heavy stones directly on his exposed chest in a deliberate attempt to force him into publicly renouncing his newfound belief. Bilal endured this torment again and again, repeating a single simple word of faith under his breath the entire time, refusing to give in, no matter how unbearable the physical pain became with each passing hour. An elderly married couple, Yasir and his wife Sumayya, along with their adult son Ammar, suffered some of the harshest and most sustained persecution recorded from this entire early period. Sumayya was ultimately killed for her steadfast refusal to abandon her belief, becoming, in the process, the very first martyr in the entire history of Islam. Her husband Yasir was tortured relentlessly until he too eventually died from his injuries. Their son Ammar was beaten repeatedly and pressured so severely and for so long that he eventually spoke words against his own faith, simply in a desperate attempt to survive the ongoing torment. When he later came to Muhammad afterward, visibly broken and deeply ashamed of what he had said under duress, he was met not with condemnation, but with genuine comfort, and was gently reassured that what mattered most in the end was the sincerity that still remained firmly rooted in his heart. Despite all of this mounting suffering, the underlying message continued to spread steadily, if slowly. People increasingly risked everything they had simply for the chance to hear him speak directly. Some individuals who had initially despised him found themselves quietly listening from a distance late at night, drawn in by something in the rhythm and content of the Quran's verses that they struggled to fully explain even to themselves. And remarkably, some among those who had originally come specifically to mock him ended up leaving as genuine believers instead. Frustrated that neither persecution nor bribery had managed to stop the movement's steady growth, the leaders of Quraysh eventually devised an entirely new and more comprehensive strategy: total social and economic isolation. They carefully drafted a formal written agreement declaring that no resident of Makkah would be permitted to trade with, marry into, speak with, or offer any form of assistance whatsoever to Muhammad's own clan, known as Banu Hashim, nor to any of his growing number of followers. This document was formally signed, sealed with wax, and then publicly hung inside the Kaaba itself as a binding and highly visible declaration to the entire city. As a direct result of this agreement, Muhammad's entire clan, including both sincere believers and skeptical non-believers alike, simply by virtue of their shared bloodline, was forcibly driven out of the city and into a narrow, barren, rocky valley on its outskirts, known as Shib Abi Talib. For nearly 3 grueling years, they endured severe hardship there, almost entirely cut off from regular trade, adequate food supplies, and any meaningful outside support. Children cried openly from persistent hunger throughout the nights. Families were reduced to surviving on tree leaves and whatever meager scraps could occasionally be found or scavenged. A small number of more compassionate individuals living outside the boycott secretly smuggled food into the valley under the cover of darkness, risking serious personal consequences to do so. But for the overwhelming majority of Makkah's population, the suffering unfolding just outside the city walls was met largely with indifferent silence. Throughout this entire prolonged ordeal, Muhammad remained continuously among his suffering people, leading them in daily prayer, offering whatever comfort and reassurance he genuinely could, and consistently reminding them that hardship of this magnitude does not and cannot last forever, no matter how impossible relief might feel in any given moment. Eventually, a prominent Makkan leader named Mutim ibn Adi, visibly disturbed by the sheer cruelty of the ongoing boycott, organized a small group of like-minded individuals to formally challenge and overturn it. When this group went to physically remove the original written document from inside the Kaaba, they made a startling discovery. Insects had, over the preceding years, eaten through almost the entire text of the agreement, leaving intact only a small fragment that happened to reference the name of God. This unexpected coincidence stunned even many of the boycott's original supporters, and not long afterward, the entire agreement was formally and permanently abandoned. Muhammad and his exhausted followers were finally permitted to return to their homes within the city. The relief that followed, however, proved painfully short-lived. Very soon after the boycott officially ended, tragedy struck twice in rapid succession. Abu Talib, the very uncle who had raised Muhammad since early childhood and shielded him personally from Quraysh's harshest hostility for well over 3 decades, fell seriously and suddenly ill. Muhammad sat quietly at his uncle's bedside during his final hours, gently encouraging him to formally accept the faith with his very last words, hoping earnestly to intercede on his behalf afterward. But surrounded even in his final moments by the watchful pressure of Makkah's tribal leaders, Abu Talib ultimately chose to remain loyal to the traditions and beliefs of his ancestors instead. His subsequent death left Muhammad, for the first time in his adult life, entirely without the crucial tribal protection that had shielded him for so many years. Only a short time afterward, Khadija, his devoted wife of 25 years, the very first believer in his mission, the woman who had personally comforted him on the terrifying night the angel first appeared to him, and who had stood loyally beside him through every conceivable hardship since, also passed away, weakened considerably by the deprivations of the recent boycott, during which she had willingly given away much of her own remaining resources in order to help others survive. Her body finally succumbed. Muhammad's grief during this period was genuinely immense. Within an extraordinarily short span of time, he had lost both his primary protector and his closest, most trusted companion simultaneously. This particularly difficult chapter of his life would later become widely known among his followers as the Year of Sorrow. And yet, even buried under the full weight of this compounded grief, he did not abandon the mission he had been given. He did not retreat into bitterness, nor did he allow understandable despair to derail him from the path he had committed himself to years earlier. He continued moving forward, carrying his grief in precisely the same manner he had always carried every other hardship throughout his difficult life, quietly, with tremendous patience, and with an unshaken conviction that the path set before him still mattered profoundly, regardless of how heavy the personal cost had become. What makes this particular story endure so powerfully across so many centuries is not simply the sheer volume of hardship that Muhammad experienced throughout his early life, but rather the manner in which he consistently chose to carry that hardship. He was orphaned repeatedly before he ever had a genuine chance to experience the security of a stable parent's protection. He was mocked and ridiculed by the very same people who had once trusted him completely and without reservation. He was offered substantial wealth and considerable political power in direct exchange for his silence, and he answered every single offer with unwavering patience instead. He personally watched people he loved deeply suffer and, in several tragic cases, die simply for standing loyally beside him, and even then, he never once turned toward cruelty or revenge in response. Every insult directed his way was consistently met with genuine restraint. Every act of betrayal was ultimately met with forgiveness rather than resentment. Every devastating loss was carried forward with quiet dignity rather than collapsing into despair. There is a lesson embedded within all of this that applies broadly to anyone listening, regardless of personal belief or background. The simple but profound idea that genuine character is not built during moments of comfort and ease, but rather revealed and strengthened in how a person chooses to respond when everything familiar is suddenly stripped away from them. Muhammad possessed no army during those difficult early years, no meaningful wealth to fall back on, no reliable guarantee of even basic survival from one season to the next. What he did possess, consistently and without exception, was an integrity that never once wavered under pressure, and it was ultimately that unwavering integrity, more than any single other factor, which gradually transformed skeptical strangers into devoted believers and even determined enemies into quiet admirers over time. This particular telling represents only the earliest chapter of what would eventually become a much longer and even more remarkable journey, one that would go on to carry him from a persecuted outsider struggling for survival within his own birth city to becoming arguably the single most influential figure in all of recorded human history. But even confined to these difficult early years alone, the underlying pattern of his entire life is already unmistakably clear. Truth consistently spoken with gentleness, rather than aggression, patience carried steadily through even the most unbearable pain, and a heart that, remarkably, never once hardened completely, no matter how relentlessly the world around him tried repeatedly to break it. May this story stay with you a little longer than most, and may whatever strength carried a grieving, orphaned boy through unimaginable loss find its way, in some small measure, into whatever you happen to be carrying today. Khuda Hafiz.